The snow wasn't just falling, it was erasing the world. It swallowed the train station whole, turning it into a ghost on the edge of nowhere. And on that platform stood Evelyn Grace, a girl so cold she looked like she was made of ice herself. Her shawl was useless, a thin rag against a wind that had teeth. She stared down at the tracks, maybe wishing they'd open up and take her. A man tried to help her down, his hand brushing her arm. She recoiled like he was fire. "Don't touch me," she whispered, the words turning to frost. "I'm broken." She didn't mean for anyone to hear, but in the dead quiet of the snow, every sound carried. Heads turned. A few people looked sad for her. Most just looked angry. You could almost hear them thinking it. Shameful. A girl like that. The meanest eyes belonged to Evelyn Mayfield, the town matriarch, snug in her furs. She looked at Evelyn Grace with a cold satisfaction, like the girl's misery was the juiciest piece of gossip she'd heard all year. Evelyn Grace just shrank into herself, trying to disappear into the storm, and that's when he appeared. He walked out of the white blur at the end of the platform like he was born from the storm itself, a giant of a man. His hair was as white as the snow, but his skin was the color of summer earth. And strangest of all, in the middle of this biting blizzard, he was bare-chested. The townspeople fell silent. They knew him. White Hawk. His silence was louder than any shout. He didn't look at anyone else, just her. He walked right up to Evelyn Grace, his boots making deep prints in the snow-covered wood. The snow landed on his shoulders and melted instantly, like he had a furnace burning inside him. She thought he was going to say it, to name her shame right there for everyone to hear. But he didn't. He just held out his hand. Not to grab her, not to force her, just an open palm, an invitation. The choice, it seemed, was hers. The crowd started whispering again, about decency, about a savage taking a white girl. Sheriff Amos Cutter watched from under the brim of his hat but didn't make a move. Evelyn's heart was a drum against her ribs. Every part of her screamed to run, but she was too tired, too hungry, too cold. She didn't take his hand, but she didn't run either. And in that single moment of hesitation, he made the choice for her. He bent down, scooped her up like she weighed nothing, and turned his back on the station. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "He's taking her," someone cried. But nobody moved. Nobody tried to stop him. Maybe it was his size. Maybe it was his silence. Or maybe, just maybe, the storm had picked a side. He carried her straight into the white wall of snow, and the town vanished behind them. Evelyn buried her face in his shoulder, hiding from the wind and the hateful eyes. She could feel the heat pouring off his skin, a steady, impossible warmth. Her last thought before the cold and hunger took over was the whisper she'd repeated like a prayer. "I'm broken." He never answered. His steps were the only reply, crunching through the snow, carrying her away from one kind of danger and straight into another. The world was just white noise and the steady rhythm of his heart against her cheek. He walked for what felt like hours, never slowing, never speaking. Her shame was a snake, twisting in her gut, telling her to fight, to scream. But her body was a traitor, clinging to his impossible warmth. Finally, a shape appeared in the gloom, a small cabin, hunkered down against the trees like a sleeping animal. Smoke curled from its chimney. This was it, the end of the line. She didn't know if it was a punishment or a rescue. He kicked the door open and carried her inside. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke. He set her down gently on a bearskin rug near the fire, close enough to feel the heat, but not so close that it felt like a threat. She watched him, her eyes wide with fear, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But he just tended the fire, his hands patient and sure. The flames leaped up, casting his shadow huge and dark against the log walls. He glanced at her only once, a quick, unreadable look, before turning back to the hearth. No man had ever been this close to her without wanting something, without taking something. His silence was a weapon she didn't understand. It stripped her of all her defenses. The storm howled outside, a wild thing trying to get in, but inside there was only the crackle of the fire and the pounding of her own heart. Why? Why did he bring her here? What did he want from her? He rose and crossed the room, but he didn't come toward her. He placed a thick wool blanket near her feet, within reach, then went back to his side of the cabin. He sat on a stool, as still as a statue, and stared into the flames. Evelyn pulled the blanket around her shoulders. It was coarse, but it was warm. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she stopped shivering. She stole a look at him. His face, lit by the fire, was all hard angles and shadows, unreadable. A map of a land she'd never know. Exhaustion finally started to win. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought she saw his hand move, just a twitch, as if he wanted to reach for her but stopped himself. The last thing she heard was the wind screaming and the slow, steady sound of his breathing. A sound that was both a comfort and a threat. She was afraid he would leave her alone in the wilderness, but a deeper, darker fear was that he never would. Morning was a sliver of gray light through the logs. The storm hadn't quit. Evelyn woke under the blanket, the fire a pile of glowing embers. And across the room, he was still there, sitting in the exact same spot, watchful and silent, as if he hadn't moved all night. For a second, she thought she'd dreamed him up, a silent giant conjured by a freezing, desperate mind. But the dull ache in her body where he'd carried her was real. He was real. When she stirred, he rose without a sound, added wood to the fire, and set a tin cup of water beside her. Then he returned to his stool. No words, just this thick, heavy silence. But it wasn't an angry silence. It was something else, something she couldn't name. The shame was still there, though, a voice in her head, whispering the words she'd heard at the station. Broken, ruined. Later, the storm eased a little. He opened the door, and a blast of clean, cold air filled the cabin. He motioned with his head for her to follow. She hesitated, but she went. Outside, the world was brand new, buried under a thick blanket of white. He handed her a small bundle of firewood. It wasn't heavy. It was just enough for her to carry, as if he knew her limits better than she did. They worked together, stacking the wood in a small lean-to. The simple work, the crisp air, it steadied her. He still didn't speak. But his silence wasn't empty anymore. It was a presence, a shield against the voices in her head. But those voices were still talking back in town. Sheriff Cutter and Evelyn Mayfield were making sure of that. At the general store, they said the Indian had stolen her, kidnapped her. Worse. They painted a picture of a savage and his helpless victim. No one considered that she might be safer in this silent cabin than she ever was in their town. Judgment was the town's lifeblood. And Evelyn Grace was the latest sacrifice. Back in the cabin, she could feel their judgment like a physical weight. She watched him oil a leather strap, his hands slow and careful. Did he hear the rumors? Did he even care? Maybe he was used to it, an outsider living on the edge of their world. She realized she was staring, tracing the lines on his face in the firelight. He knew she was looking, but he didn't turn. For the first time, a heat rose in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire and nothing to do with shame. The days started to blur. Snow, fire, work, silence. She started to take care of the cabin, sweeping the floor, folding the blanket, small things. He never asked her to, but she saw a softening in his eyes when he noticed. A quiet approval. One afternoon, she burned her hand on the hot kettle. Before she could even cry out, he was across the room, plunging her hand into a bucket of cool water. She flinched, expecting him to hold on, but he let go immediately. When she looked up, his face held only concern. Sometimes she'd wake in the middle of the night and see him sitting by the door, a silhouette against the dark, as if he were guarding the cabin. Was he watching for the town, or for the wolves she sometimes heard howling in the distance? The whispers from town got louder in her mind. Taken, defiled. But here, in this cabin, no one hurt her. No one touched her, without care. The only wounds were the ones she'd brought with her. And slowly, his silence was starting to heal them. One day, returning from the creek with water, she stopped at the door. He was inside, kneeling by the fire. The sight of him, so steady, so present, sent a strange ache through her. Without thinking, she whispered it. "Why are you kind?" The words hung in the air. He didn't turn around. He just went still for a moment. Then he glanced over his shoulder, and in his eyes she saw a flash of something she didn't expect. Pain. As if her question had struck a nerve she didn't know he had. She immediately regretted speaking. She had broken the silence. She had broken the peace. That night, the storm came back with a vengeance. She lay awake, the shame coiling in her stomach. She didn't belong here. She was putting him in danger. The town would come back. They'd have torches this time. They would burn this place to the ground, all because of her. She looked across the fire at him. His face was like a stone cliff in the flickering light, and a new, terrifying thought hit her. Maybe he wasn't just hiding her. Maybe he was waiting for them, daring them to come. And what would happen when they did? What would it mean if this silent man, who had saved her from the town, decided he was never, ever going to let her go? The fear was sharper than the cold, a blade twisting in her gut. She had escaped a cage, only to find herself in a fortress. And she had no idea if the man who held the key was her guardian or her jailer. The cabin became their whole world. Snow piled up to the windows, and the forest outside was just a series of gray shadows. The only thing that felt real was the fire and the silent rhythm they built around it. Evelyn found a purpose in the small tasks, mending a tear in his shirt, keeping the kettle full. He never told her what to do, but he watched her. She saw him once, his eyes fixed on her hands as she stitched a seam. There was a look on his face she couldn't place. Not pity. Something like recognition. As if her small act of mending something broken reminded him of his own scars. One evening, he came in from the cold, his coat heavy with ice. Without thinking, she reached out and brushed the snow from his sleeve. Her fingers lingered for a second too long. She snatched her hand back, her cheeks burning. He didn't move. He just stood there, letting the ice melt and drip onto the floor. The silence between them suddenly felt different. It was charged, electric. He broke the spell by turning to put another log on the fire. But something had changed. A line had been crossed. Later that night, the silence became too much to bear. She had to fill it. "I used to think a fire meant home," she said to the flames, her voice barely a whisper. "But my home was full of voices, and voices can be sharper than any blade." She dug her nails into her palms. "They called me ruined. They said I was nothing, and the worst part is, I believed them. I still do." The confession fell into the quiet room. She finally dared to look at him. His dark eyes were on her, steady and deep. He wasn't judging her. He was just listening. His silence was a space for her to finally put down the heavy things she'd been carrying. He leaned forward, picked up a charred stick from the hearth, and drew a single, straight line on the log wall beside the fireplace. She frowned. "What is that for?" He didn't answer. He just tapped the stick to his own chest, then pointed it at the mark on the wall. He was keeping a record, a tally. But of what? After that night, she started talking more. Little things at first. Memories of her mother. The emptiness her father left behind. The story of the betrayal that had sent her to that train station in the first place. Every time she spoke, she braced for his judgment. but it never came. One evening, she was mending his old coat again. "I'm not worth all this trouble," she said softly. He took the coat from her, put it on, and stood tall by the fire. The new stitches she'd made were barely visible. Then, he took the coat off and gently draped it over her shoulders. The warmth and weight of it, the simple, unspoken gesture, made her eyes well up with tears she couldn't stop. That night, the wolves came back. Their howls were close, slicing through the wind. Evelyn jumped, pulling the coat tighter around her. White Hawk simply picked up his axe and went to stand by the door, a silent guardian, until the howling faded into the distance. He came back and sat down as if nothing had happened. And she saw it then. This is how he lived. Facing down storms, facing down wolves, facing down the judgment of the world. And a profound respect began to grow in her heart, pushing aside some of the fear. A trapper named Jedediah Boone rode by the cabin one afternoon. He saw them from a distance. Evelyn carrying wood, White Hawk splitting logs. A quiet domestic scene. Jedediah was an old man who'd seen a lot. He just tipped his hat and kept riding. Later, in town, he'd say that sometimes two broken branches, leaned against each other, can withstand a storm better than a healthy tree standing alone. The words wouldn't stop the gossip, but they were the truth. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The fear was back, a cold knot in her stomach. "I'm afraid," she whispered into the firelight. "I'm afraid the town will come back for me. I'm afraid you'll get tired of me and send me away. And I'm afraid that if I stay, you'll see what they all see, that I'm not worthy of being saved." She had laid her heart bare. It was the most honest she had ever been in her life. Across the fire, his eyes held hers. The silence stretched, and she could feel her own pulse beating in the quiet. Then he did something that spoke louder than any words. He touched his own chest with his palm, a gesture of sincerity. Then he opened his hand and extended it toward her. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a claim. It was an offer. A silent vow. Her breath hitched. She had to look away. It was too much. Later, she got up to add a log to the fire. Her hands were shaking, and the log slipped. Before it could fall into the embers and send sparks flying, his hand was there, covering hers, steadying it. Their skin touched. Just for a second. It felt like a bolt of lightning. She pulled her hand away like she'd been burned, but the feeling lingered. A spark deep in her bones. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She glanced toward the window, where the snow was a swirling gray curtain, and that's when she saw it. Flickering lights in the distance, moving through the trees. Torches. Her voice was a strangled whisper. "They're here." For the first time since she'd met him, White Hawk's silence was broken. Not by a word, but by the sound of his stool scraping across the wooden floor as he rose to his full, imposing height and turned to face the door. Judgment had come calling. The torchlight painted ugly, dancing shadows on the snow. And with the light came the voices, the same harsh, judgmental voices from the station. Sheriff Cutter was at the front of the posse, his face grim. Right behind him, a smirk on her face, was Evelyn Mayfield. They had a half-dozen men with them, all carrying rifles. They weren't here to talk. The first knock on the door was a punch. "Open up, White Hawk!" the sheriff yelled. "We're here for the girl! You've got no right to keep her!" Evelyn shrank back toward the fire. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading. Her whole life, men had decided her fate. And it was happening again. White Hawk didn't answer. He just stood there, a mountain in the doorway. He opened the door just enough to block the entrance with his body. The fire behind him, the storm in front of him. "That girl is a disgrace," Evelyn Mayfield screeched. "She belongs with her own kind, not holed up with you." The word ruined echoed in Evelyn Grace's ears. The shame was a hot poker in her chest. For a second, she wanted to run out there, to give herself up, just to make it stop. But she froze. Because White Hawk took a step forward, his bare chest meeting the freezing wind, completely shielding the inside of the cabin from their view. He still hadn't said a word. He was daring them. With silence. The sheriff shifted his feet, suddenly looking less sure of himself. The town won't stand for this, Hawk. You can't just take her. Evelyn saw the scene then, as if from a great height. The angry mob, the warm cabin, and the one silent man standing between them. He wasn't just protecting her body. He was protecting her from their words, from the poison they'd been feeding her whole life. The sheriff raised his torch. Evelyn Grace, you in there? You come on out. We'll take you home. Home. The word was a lie. Her home was a cage of whispers and stares. Her legs were shaking, but she stood up. She walked toward the door. White Hawk turned his head just slightly, his eyes finding hers. He wouldn't stop her. This had to be her choice. She stepped into the doorway, standing just behind him, her shadow stretching out long on the snow. Evelyn Mayfield's face lit up with triumph when she saw her. Evelyn Grace's mouth was dry, but the words came anyway. I don't belong to you, she said, her voice trembling but clear. I am not a broken thing for you to fix or display. I choose to be here. The wind died down for a second. The world went silent. You could see the breath of every person hanging in the cold air. Evelyn Mayfield's triumphant smile vanished. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He spat on the snow. Have it your way, but don't come crying to us when you're starving. This town has a long memory. He turned and led his posse away. The torches dwindled, becoming little orange sparks in the blizzard before disappearing completely. The door closed. The cabin was quiet again, but it was a different quiet. The quiet of a battle won. Evelyn slid down the wall, her legs giving out. She had done it. She had spoken up for herself. The sound of her own voice, her own defiance, was still ringing in her ears. White Hawk walked past her and put a log on the fire. Then he went back to his stool. She looked at him, desperate for some sign of approval. He just met her gaze, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. He didn't have to say anything. His silence was her answer. It was respect. A fragile sense of strength started to bloom in her chest, but the fear was still there. The town wasn't gone. They were just waiting. She pulled the coat he'd given her tighter. The storm outside raged on, but the real storm was yet to come. She watched him check the latch on the door, his hand steady and sure. He wasn't just a shield anymore. He was a warrior, preparing for the next attack. And a strange, terrifying question popped into her head. What if she wasn't just a refugee he was sheltering? What if she was the reason he was finally ready to fight? The blizzard became a living thing, a monster of wind and snow that wanted to tear the cabin from the earth. The roof groaned under the weight. The town was gone, but their threats hung in the air, colder than the wind. Evelyn could still hear their voices calling her ruined, a brand seared into her soul. But then she'd look at White Hawk. He was sharpening his axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel a calming sound in the chaos. He moved with a purpose that defied the storm. He knew this wasn't over. The horses in the lean-to were screaming with fear. The wolves were back, not just howling this time. They were close, circling. The cabin felt like a tiny, fragile island in a sea of violence. Nature on one side, man on the other, both of them hungry. The main roof beam let out a terrible crack. Evelyn instinctively rushed to it, pushing up with her hands as if her small frame could hold back the weight of the entire storm. White Hawk was there in an instant. His huge hand covered the beam, steadying it. With his other, he gently guided her away. He didn't touch her skin, just the sleeve of her coat, but the message was clear. You are not in this alone. The night exploded. The wolves weren't just circling anymore, They were attacking the lean-to, trying to get to the terrified horses. Evelyn could see their eyes through the cracks in the logs, glowing like hellfire. White Hawk grabbed his axe. This was it. But Evelyn didn't cower by the fire. She grabbed a burning log from the hearth, a makeshift torch. Her hand trembled, but her eyes were fierce. Their gazes locked across the room. It wasn't a question. It was an understanding. She would fight too. He gave a single, sharp nod. Respect. And then he threw the door open. The world was a whirlwind of white and shadow. The wolves lunged, a wave of fur and teeth. White Hawk met them head-on, his axe a blur of fire-lit steel. The sound of the blade hitting bone was sickening. Evelyn screamed, a raw, primal sound, and thrust her torch at a wolf that got too close. Its fur sizzled, and it yelped, backing away. She had never felt so terrified, and so alive. Her heart wasn't just beating with fear. It was beating with rage. She stumbled, and the torch nearly fell from her grasp. A hand caught her arm, steadying her. White Hawk. He didn't even look at her, his focus entirely on the fight, but his touch anchored her. Together, they were a force. The man of stone and the girl of fire. They pushed the pack back, step by step, into the blizzard, until the last shadow had vanished into the screaming wind. He slammed the door shut. The sudden silence was deafening. Evelyn collapsed against the wall, the torch falling and smoking on the floor. Her breath came in ragged sobs. White Hawk leaned against the door, his chest heaving, his axe dripping with dark blood. Their eyes met. The world outside, the town, the past, it all fell away. There was only this room, this fire, and the two of them. And something inside her finally broke. Not from fear, from relief. The tears she hadn't shed at the station, the tears she hadn't cried when the town came for her, they came now. A storm inside to match the one outside. He didn't try to comfort her, he just let her cry. He sat by the fire, his presence a silent witness to her pain and her release. When the tears finally stopped, her face was raw, her voice hoarse. "All my life," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "They told me what I was, broken, worthless, unwanted." She looked into the fire, her eyes blazing. "Tonight, I wasn't any of those things. Tonight I was alive." The confession hung between them. White Hawk looked at her, his face unreadable, but his eyes full of a deep, ancient sorrow. He set the axe aside. And then, he did what he had done at the station. He held out his hand, palm up. But this time was different. She wasn't the same broken girl. Her body was shaking, but her spirit was steady. She reached out and placed her hand in his. His skin was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. He didn't squeeze or hold tight. He just let her hand rest in his, a partnership, a choice freely made. The storm raged on, but it couldn't touch them. Evelyn felt the weight of her shame, the years of it, begin to lift. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't just hers to carry anymore. They sat like that for hours, hand in hand, as the fire burned low. As dawn approached, exhaustion finally claimed her. She leaned her head back against the wall, her eyes closing, her hand still in his. She felt him move. He reached with his free hand and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her face. It was the most tender touch she had ever known. Her eyes fluttered open. He was looking at her, and for the first time, she saw past the stone. She saw the man. And in his eyes, she saw everything he couldn't say. A silent promise, more binding than any words. She closed her eyes again, leaning into his touch, and felt a peace she had never known. For the first time in her life, she felt whole. But the peace was shattered by a sound from outside, the crunch of heavy boots in the snow. Not one person, several, moving with purpose. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, her hand clenched his. White Hawk didn't move, but his whole body went rigid. His gaze fixed on the door. He took a slow, deep breath. They were back. And this time, they weren't going to leave with just a warning. This time, they were here to finish it. But it wasn't the sheriff's posse. The footsteps were too steady, too disciplined. The knock on the door wasn't angry. It was firm. Official. White Hawk rose, his hand leaving hers, the warmth instantly gone. He motioned for her to stay back, away from the door, before he opened it a crack. Standing outside were 3 men in thick winter coats, their faces hardened by the cold and something more. They weren't from the town. They wore the badges of U.S. Marshals. The lead marshal, a man with a graying beard and eyes that missed nothing, didn't look at White Hawk. His gaze swept the cabin and landed on Evelyn. "Evelyn Grace?" he asked, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that filled the small space. She could only nod, her heart hammering. "My name is Marshal Thompson. We've been looking for you for weeks." He paused, his eyes flicking back to White Hawk. And for him. The world tilted on its axis. They weren't here for her shame. They weren't here because of the town's gossip. This was something else entirely. "I don't understand," she whispered. Marshal Thompson's eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "Ma'am, the man you ran from, the man who left you at that station. His name is Silas Mayfield, Evelyn Mayfield's son." Evelyn stared, confused. Silas was the reason for her shame, the man whose advances she'd rejected, earning her the town's scorn. "We know he didn't just hurt you," the marshal continued, his voice dropping. "We believe he's responsible for the disappearance of several other women along the rail line, and we believe you were the last person to see one of them alive." The secret she'd been forced to carry, the real reason she was broken, wasn't a matter of shame. It was a matter of murder. She had seen Silas with another girl, a girl who vanished the next day. Her refusal of him wasn't just about honor, it was about fear. She knew what he was capable of. The town, led by his mother, hadn't just shamed her. They had tried to silence a witness. The marshal turned his full attention to White Hawk. "As for you, your real name is John Talon. You were a scout for the army. You testified against a corrupt officer who was selling government rifles, an officer who happened to be Evelyn Mayfield's husband, Silas's father. He died in prison. They've had a warrant out for your arrest on trumped-up charges ever since. They used it to drive you out of society, to make you a ghost." Suddenly everything clicked into place. The marks on the wall. They weren't just a tally. White Hawk, or John Talon, had been tracking the missing women. He hadn't just stumbled upon her at the station. He had been watching, waiting. He knew who she was, and he knew she was in danger. He hadn't saved her from the cold. He had saved her from a killer. His silence wasn't just his nature. It was a necessity. A wanted man couldn't afford to draw attention. His kindness wasn't random. It was justice. "The Mayfield family runs this county," Marshal Thompson said grimly. "The sheriff, the judge. They're all in her pocket. They've been protecting Silas for years. We couldn't get to him, until now. With your testimony," he looked at Evelyn, "and yours," he looked at John, "we can finally burn the whole rotten structure to the ground." The pieces fell into place with a horrifying crash. The town hadn't just been cruel. They were accessories to murder. Evelyn Mayfield wasn't just a gossip. She was a monster protecting her monstrous son. And the silent man who had rescued Evelyn wasn't a savage. He was the only law in a lawless land. But before anyone could speak, another sound cut through the morning air. A single, high-pitched whistle from the trees. John Talon's head snapped up. "It's a lookout," he said, his first words to her a warning. "They know you're here." The marshals drew their weapons. "Inside, now," Thompson ordered. They crowded into the tiny cabin just as the first shot rang out, splintering the wood of the doorframe. Sheriff Cutter, Silas Mayfield, and the men from the town had followed the marshals. They weren't going to let their secrets be dragged into the light. The cabin, once a sanctuary, was now a trap. Gunfire erupted from the trees. The marshals returned fire, the tiny cabin filling with smoke and the deafening roar of pistols. Evelyn flattened herself against the floor, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the wood. This was it, the final battle. Not against wolves or storms, but against the smiling, friendly faces of the people who had judged her, condemned her, and tried to bury her alive under the weight of their lies. John Talon wasn't using a gun. He moved to the side of the door, his axe held ready. He was waiting, patient, a hunter. One of the townsmen made a break for the side window, trying to get a clear shot. John moved with impossible speed. The door flew open. He was outside for a split second, and the sound of the axe was a dull, final thud. He was back inside before the man's body even hit the snow. The firefight was brutal and short. The marshals were professionals, but they were outnumbered. One of them went down, clutching his leg. Through the smoke, Evelyn saw Silas Mayfield, his face twisted in a mask of rage, taking aim at Marshal Thompson. Without thinking, she grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. She scrambled across the floor as Silas burst through the door, his pistol raised. She screamed and swung the poker with all her might, striking his arm. The gun clattered to the floor. Silas roared in pain and backhanded her, sending her sprawling. He lunged for the gun, but he never made it. John Talon was on him. It wasn't a fight. It was a storm, a force of nature unleashed. He didn't use the axe. He used his hands. And when it was over, Silas Mayfield was a broken heap on the floor. The remaining townsmen saw their leader fall, and their courage broke. They fled into the woods. The silence that fell was more profound than any before it. It was the silence of an ending. In the aftermath, the cabin was a wreck. Smoke filled the air, and the smell of gunpowder was thick. Marshal Thompson knelt beside Silas, checking for a pulse. He's alive. He'll stand trial. He looked at Evelyn, then at John. So will his mother, and the sheriff. We got them all. He stood up, his face etched with respect. You two, you did what a whole town was too corrupt or too scared to do. You stood for what was right. He walked over to John. The charges against you are officially dropped. You're a free man, John Talon. John just nodded, his eyes finding Evelyn's across the ruined room. The world had been set right. The voices that had haunted her were silenced, not by force, but by truth. The shame she carried had been a lie, a weapon used to control her. And in the face of real monsters, she had found she was not broken at all. She was a survivor. As the marshals took the prisoners away, Evelyn and John stood in the doorway of the battered cabin. The sun was finally breaking through the clouds, making the fresh snow glitter. The world felt clean, new. She turned to him, the man of silence. You knew, she said. The whole time, you knew who I was. He met her gaze, and for the first time, a small, weary smile touched his lips. I knew you were strong enough to survive, he said, his voice deep and rough from disuse. I just had to make sure you knew it too. He reached out, not to offer a hand, but to gently touch her cheek. A touch that held no questions, no demands. Only a shared understanding of the storm they had weathered together. In the end, it wasn't the town that defined her, or the man who saved her. It was the moment she stood in the doorway and spoke her own truth. She had found her voice in the heart of a blizzard, and she would never let it be silenced again. What do you think? Is true strength found in the noise of the battle, or in the quiet courage it takes to survive? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next strange and mysterious tale. Thanks for watching.